Hey, and welcome back to Found in the Garden. I hope that today is finding you well. There is still snow on the ground out here, and I don't think you can really see it in the window over here, but if you know me, you know that I am not here for it. So we are inside still. As you can see, my Christmas tree is still up. When I'm recording this video, it's still just the week after Christmas before New Year's, so our tree being up is not weird, but depending on how long it takes us to edit this and get it posted, it could be weird. So I promise that if it's like February and you're watching this, the tree is not up because it's a live tree. If it was our fake tree, it might still be up. We can be a little lazy. Today I am filming a couple videos and just talking about more things that I wished I had known when I was starting out. And I actually have my seed orders in front of me, and I'll be talking about what I ordered in another video. I might do that video today. I'm still waiting on 1 or 2 orders of seeds left. Right now, I want to talk about tomatoes, because if you're getting ready to place your first order of tomatoes, you have some thoughts. And maybe those thoughts are just get any kind of tomato, it doesn't matter. Maybe your thought is grow all the tomatoes because it's your first year and you have to decide what variety to grow. Maybe your thought is, what is a tomato? I've never heard of that before. Whatever your thoughts are on tomatoes, I think I have had most of them, except maybe not the what is a tomato, at least not in recent memory. And so we're just going to talk about them. What to look for when you're buying a tomato, either a plant or tomato seeds, what you should know, etc. And we're just going to talk about it and go from there. Okay, so to jump right in to tomatoes, the very first and most important thing that you should know that I didn't know is there are kind of 2 types of tomato plants. And when I say tomato plants, I mean the way tomatoes grow. So there's determinate tomatoes and indeterminate tomatoes. Now, determinate tomatoes grow to a determined height. They set a determined number of fruit that all ripen at a determined time, and then the plant is done. Indeterminate tomatoes grow an indeterminate height. They'll continue growing until they're done, until the plant is dead. They set an indeterminate number of fruit. In other words, they will continually add fruit over the course of the plant's life, and then they'll only die when it gets too cold for them to live. In some places, tomato plants live on and on and on and on and on. I was watching a video about someone's garden the other day. They live in Southern California, and they've had the same tomato plants for over a year now, which I think is amazing. And they just keep, like, the tomato plants keep producing, which is just like that can never happen here. We get frost, and most of you probably also get frost. So what are the pros and cons of determinate tomatoes versus indeterminate tomatoes? Determinate tomatoes, again, have a determined number of fruit and they ripen at a determined time. Indeterminate tomatoes keep producing tomatoes, and as many tomatoes as the plant can before the end of the season, the end of the plant's life, and they ripen as the fruit comes on. So for a determinate plant, you're probably going to get all of your flowers at once. They're all going to be pollinated at once, and you're going to get all of your tomatoes at once. With an indeterminate plant, you'll get them throughout the season. Indeterminate plants are great for things like cherry tomatoes, because you're going to want to harvest cherry tomatoes throughout the spring, summer, and into the fall, and have those fresh on your salads every day. That's just going to be so fun to just go out and harvest your cherry tomatoes, add those to your salad, yummy. They're great for slicing tomatoes too. So you can go out and harvest the tomato for your tomato sandwich, which, can we just talk about tomato sandwiches for a minute? The thing I miss most about summer right now is tomato sandwiches. There was a phase in this summer where all I ate was tomato sandwiches. I was like, haven't had breakfast, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm gonna have a tomato sandwich, and then that's all I ate. So those are great. Indeterminate varieties are great for that because you have fresh tomatoes coming on throughout the season. Determinate varieties are really great when you want to collect tomatoes to make sauce or crushed tomatoes to can. When you want to have all of your tomatoes all at once so that you can process them and get them put up. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot use indeterminate tomatoes to put up. All of the tomatoes that I grew last year, every single one of my over 200 tomato plants that I grew last year were indeterminate tomatoes. So do not come at me with any sort of anger. I'm not saying that you can't. I'm saying that it's easier, especially if you have the time and maybe you're a work from home, stay at home person, mother, wife, single person, you're at home all the time, and you can take the time out of your other activities to process all the tomatoes all at once and create all your sauces and all your crushed tomatoes, all your canned tomato things all at once, then determinate tomatoes are going to be awesome for you because you can get them, you know about when the fruit is going to set, when it's going to be ripe, and you can plan, okay, from this date to this date, I'm going to be at home, I'm going to be canning tomato sauce, I need to have all of my canning stuff put together, I need to take time out of my schedule, I'm not going to be traveling those 2 weeks, whatever it is you need to do to kind of plan your life around when these determinate tomatoes ripen. And that is great, and that is so useful. Indeterminate varieties, you can still put those up. I do it differently because, well, when I had 200 tomato plants, it doesn't really matter. Like, once the tomatoes start coming in, they do not stop. Like, there's so many tomatoes when you have 200 plus tomato plants. But if you have a smaller garden and you have indeterminate tomato plants, those tomatoes might come in slower, just a little too fast for you to eat, but not fast enough for you to pull out the canning equipment, get everything sanitized and set up, and then you're just gonna can 1 pint jar of tomato sauce. Most people don't like to do that. That's a lot of effort. Now, if you do, you continue to live your best life. I'm not telling you how you should deal with that. I'm just saying for me, that wasn't realistic. Also for me last year, it wasn't realistic for me to put up any canned tomatoes. I have never canned by myself. Call me out in the comments, it's fine. I am still learning, and canning intimidates me so badly. So if you know how to can and you're my friend and you live near, please come save me from myself and teach me how to can. But so what I did is I had all of these indeterminate tomatoes. We would go out typically on a Sunday and we would harvest all of the tomatoes that we could harvest in a day. And I would sit in here and I would process the tomatoes. And by processing it, I mean I would core them and I would throw them in a Ziploc bag. Now this year I cored them and I cut an X on the bottom because what I had been told is that you'll want to, that way you can just slip them out of the skins, like the tomato out of the skins. And yes, that's true, but I found that once I put it in the freezer, which is what you do, you core it, cut an X on the bottom, stick it in a Ziploc bag, throw them in the freezer to pull out when you're ready. But what I have found is I don't worry about taking the skins off. If that's really weird to you and you can't imagine a world in which tomato skins are on in your sauce, you don't need to do that. But for me, I don't need the tomato skins removed. I make tomato sauce. That's all I've done with it so far. And I just blend it up in my Vitamix. My Vitamix blends well enough that you can't tell that the tomato skins are in it. So it's not the end of the world. So yeah, that's how I processed it. I would wash all of them, core them, cut them, put them in Ziploc bags, and throw them in the freezer. Now, I did not even like dice them up. I just, the whole tomato right in the Ziploc bag and throw it in the freezer. For cherry tomatoes, I just cut off the ends and threw them into bags into the freezer. And I would mix the yellows, the reds, the purples, the greens, all the tomatoes into one bag. And it has, we eat tomato sauce every week. I grab out a couple bags and we eat tomato sauce, and it's delicious, it's fresh, and it tastes great, and that's wonderful. And that was a really manageable way for me to deal with the influx of tomatoes because I had too many and I needed to freeze them because I couldn't process them at that time. I couldn't can them at that time. I will tell you, because we had so many tomato plants, I had to buy an entire extra freezer. So that might not be sustainable. If you don't have a ton of freezers, you will probably want to learn how to can. As I learned how to can, my promise to you is I will set up this camera and we will learn together. So be watching for that coming this fall, this summer or fall. If you are not getting enough tomatoes to process though, you can use the same tactic of, okay, this week I harvested 3 tomatoes, or this week I didn't use 3 of my tomatoes. I'm gonna wash them, core them, and put them in a freezer bag. And you can gather your tomatoes up as the season goes until you have a big enough harvest to go ahead and process and make your sauce or your crushed tomatoes or whatever it is you are using tomatoes for. One thing I will say really quick is the frozen tomato method is not great if you want like crushed tomatoes. So I think that basically that's indeterminate tomatoes and determinate tomatoes. And that's a big deal because it will set the tone for how you plan to harvest, process, and use your tomatoes. If you're growing a garden, I highly recommend having both. Now, I say this as somebody who's only had a garden for 2 years, or a big garden for 1 year. This is going into my 2nd year. But I would never want to get like all my cherry tomatoes at once, right? Because I might want them more than one time in the season. Indeterminate tomatoes are great for having tomatoes throughout the season. Determinate tomatoes are great for helping you plan when you're going to process and put up your fruit, your tomatoes. The determinate, indeterminate thing, that is for all kinds of plants. So any variety that can have a determinate or indeterminate, that same thing applies. And I'll probably make a separate video about that. So the next thing that you should know about tomatoes is they come in different sizes, and you probably already know this. They can come from something as small as this, typically called a grape tomato. To be honest, I'm double checking my notes here because I don't know everything. So I wanted to make sure that this was a helpful video, not just see what Kim knows off the top of her head video. So very small to quite large. Let's see, I think the biggest tomato I harvested this year was probably about this big, maybe a little bit, yeah, probably about this big. And the smallest was like a cherry tomato. I grew some smaller varieties of tomatoes. I didn't take care of that particular plant though. It was kind of sitting up by my porch, and I think it grew 1 tomato and my daughter stole it. So I didn't even get to try it. So very small to very large. Maybe not this large, that might be a little too large. But they can get quite large, okay? So just understand that when you're picking your tomatoes, Another like catastrophic mistake I made last year was I grew over 200 tomato plants. I'm gonna keep saying that because that's a lot of tomato plants and I'm really proud of that. And at least half of them were some sort of saladette or smaller tomato. So a saladette tomato is gonna be maybe this big, okay? Maybe 2 to 3 inches long and maybe an inch wide. So very small tomatoes. I will tell you that there is nothing more frustrating than going out to harvest and spending 30 minutes on a cherry tomato plant and realizing that as you are harvesting, you are finding more. Like, there's just something so aggravating about being like, oh, I'm almost, nope, and here's more. And I really don't like picking things when they're green, so I was just trying to harvest the ripe ones. And so when you have that many tomato plants, there was too many cherry tomatoes. This year I cut back on the amount of cherry tomatoes I grew by so much. I'm only planning on having part of one of my rows dedicated to cherry tomatoes and smaller. And even that is probably gonna be more than I really want to deal with. I want to focus on slicing tomatoes. Those are tomatoes that are good on your sandwiches or diced up in your salads. I want to focus on paste tomatoes. Those are tomatoes that are going to be better for canning and freezing and using in sauces. Understanding the different sizes of the tomatoes that you're getting is really important. I'm going to throw this image up on the screen right here, and I'm going to walk you through the different sizes in the chart that I found. You can find a lot of different charts explaining the different sizes. They're all over the place, but here's at least a jumping off start. So the smallest one, very small, these are currant or grape types. Those are going to be a 1/2 inch to 1 inch in diameter, and they're going to be less than an ounce, okay? So super small. Then you have small, which are the cherry, fig, and pear type tomatoes. Those are going to be 1 to 2 ounces and 1 inch to 1.5 inches in diameter. The next is a medium. This is going to be a paste, paste and plum types. They'll weigh 2 to 5 ounces, and their diameter is going to be 1 to 3 inches. Next, you'll have a medium large, and these will be your salad and slicing types of tomatoes. They'll weigh 5 to 8 ounces and be 3 to 5 inches in diameter. Next is your large. These would be slicing and beefsteak tomatoes. They weigh between 8 and 12 ounces, and they'll be between 5 and 8 inches in diameter. Extra large is going to be a beefsteak tomato. They can weigh anywhere between 12 and 18 ounces, and they are going to be between 8 and 10 inches in diameter. And the last type, according to this chart, is this giant beefsteak type. It weighs 18 ounces and up, and they'll be larger than 10 inches in diameter. You can cite this chart over here so that you can come back and look at that and decide the best sizes for you, or at least you can, when you're reading your seed packets, know just quickly by glancing. For example, this is a large cherry tomato. Oh, okay, I know, that's small. Maybe just a couple of those plants. Tomatoes typically have 3 uses. At least this is how I classify tomatoes in my head, so that when I'm making my plan about how I want to grow, what I want to grow, etc., I am remembering how I'm going to use them. Salad tomatoes are going to be tomatoes that you pick fresh for salads. You're typically just going to pick those, wash them, and throw them right on the salad. You might have to cut them up a little bit smaller, but they're the easy kind of munching tomatoes, right? They can be in a salad, they can be on the side, but they come packaged, like pre-packaged, like they're just ready to go. The next is a slicer, and these are going to be tomatoes that you want to put on your sandwiches. Yum. Love slicing tomatoes. There's a lot of great varieties of slicers, and a lot that you're probably excited about. So definitely recommend that you grow some slicers. And the last type that I think of is paste tomatoes. There are paste tomatoes. The chart that I just read said paste tomatoes were a certain size. They can be larger than that size, so just kind of know that. But paste tomatoes typically have a, they're typically denser, I should say. They have less water content in them, and so that makes them better for creating paste. One of the things that I have learned as I'm thawing out all of these tomatoes is, wow, our tomatoes were really watery. And so as I'm creating sauce, if I'm not careful and pouring out a lot of the liquid, then my tomato sauce is really runny, and in this household, there's nothing worse than runny sauce. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if you go out and look, there will be other uses and other types of tomatoes that don't really fall into these three categories. These are the easiest three categories for me to identify, and that's how I identify them. You might come up with your own identification, and if you think of something that, oh no, she really has to mention this, go ahead and drop a note in the comments. I love to learn with you guys. So the next thing about tomatoes, and probably the thing that I love second most about tomatoes, the first thing is the taste, and that you can eat them in sandwiches. But the next thing is all the colors. So I wrote it down. So I wrote down all the tomato colors, literally, and I have them listed here. Red, pink, maybe, actually what we'll do is put some pictures here maybe. So there's red, pink, white, orange, purple, black, green, and striped, okay? Blue is also a color that tomatoes come in that's typically striped or multicolored. It's not super blue though. They're, in my experience, they're more purple. Maybe this year what I'll do is create a tomato rainbow. That'd be so pretty. If you go on Instagram, you can look up tomato rainbows, and I'll see if I can find a picture to show you here. They blow my mind. So that's something to look for. I'm not going to say one color is better than the other. I will tell you, in my experience, my husband enjoys yellow tomatoes more. They tend to be a little less acidic, so if that's something that bothers you, a lighter tomato might be better for you. Red tomatoes tend to be more acidic, and then smaller tomatoes tend to be sweeter. That doesn't mean that large tomatoes can't be sweet, but I had some cherry tomatoes in my garden, specifically the black cherry tomato, and it was like sugar sweet. There's also a tomato called Blush, and that's also a cherry tomato, a saladette size I should say, and so good. Those are two like staple, I must have these in my gardens, some of my favorite tomatoes ever. So next I want to talk about heirlooms and hybrids. Heirloom tomatoes were typically passed down specifically for their flavor. You can have something called an open pollinated plant. Now those are, I kind of just think of them as young heirlooms, to be honest. They've been recently established, both heirloom and open pollinated plants. If they're pollinated with the same plant, so if you have a black cherry tomato and it's pollinated with a black cherry tomato, it will produce a black cherry tomato. If it's not pollinated with a black cherry tomato, it will produce something else. That's just different. That's just how things go. I gotta be careful with how I talk about this, because it can be complicated, but it's not. It's pretty simple. Okay, a black cherry tomato plant will only produce black cherry tomatoes. When the flower is being pollinated, if the flower has been pollinated with a black cherry tomato plant, the seeds that come from the black cherry tomato will also be a black cherry tomato. However, if the seeds are pollinated with a zebra striped tomato, then you're gonna get a different variety of tomato, a new variety of tomato that probably haven't ever been done. So what I hear often is people will get a weird variety of, like, the tomato won't look the way that they anticipated it will look or whatever, and somebody will be like, oh, I had a yellow plant growing right next to it, a yellow tomato plant growing right next to it, did they cross-pollinate? Well, probably, because they were growing right next to it, but that has nothing to do with why this tomato might be wonky, okay? So the tomato plant will only produce black cherry tomatoes, for example. The seeds from that black cherry tomato can be a different variety of tomato because the pollination, the thing that encourages the making of fruit to continue on the plant, is saying, hey, we have this new genetic material to make a new variety, so let's try it. So don't worry about cross-pollination for your first year. The only time you need to worry about cross-pollination is when you get into seed saving, which, if you're interested in me doing a video about seed saving, let me know in the comments. But I got way off topic there. So heirlooms are going to be more tasty. The hybrids have been bred for production, for durability, like transportation, so you can pick these and they'll last for a long time, shelf stabilization. They're going to be for disease resistance. So those are the kind of things that you're going to find in a hybrid tomato plant. All of those are good. The tomatoes will still taste tomatoey, maybe not your absolute favorite, but they'll give you all of the things that you're looking for in a tomato. And you will have grown them in your own yard, which is super cool. I'm actually going to be growing both hybrids and heirlooms in my garden this year, which I'm very excited about. And I said this in my other video, but I'll just restate it here. You cannot buy GMO seeds. Unless you are like a mega farm with lots of money, then you can, but the average person cannot buy GMO seeds. You don't need to worry about that. All right, so we've kind of talked about the different types of tomatoes, what to look for when you're deciding what kind of tomatoes you want. And next is how to start tomatoes from seed. If you don't care about that, skip to the next section, but if you are curious about how to grow tomatoes from seeds, then stick around. So you'll need a starting soil of some sort. There's seed starting soil. This is your first year starting seeds. I highly recommend that. It will have all the food that you need to start your seeds, and it will be very simple. My husband likes to save us money, so we make our own soil, seed starting soil, and then we feed it with fertilizers, but that's kind of more complicated, and it's definitely more than what I want to jump into here. If you want to talk about soil recipes for seed starting, again, throw it in the comments and we'll talk about it. But for today, I just recommend grabbing a bag of seed starting soil. You're going to fill up your pot about 3/4 of the way full, and you want to plant your seed twice as deep as it is wide. Okay, so tomato seeds are really tiny, so you don't want to put these super deep. That's a massive mistake. Seeds only have so much energy to sprout up from the ground, so you want to put those just very, very not too deep, very shallowly, there we go. Cover them up with soil, keep them damp, not sopping wet, and let the seeds sprout. And depending on the variety of seeds, within about a week to 2 weeks, you should have tomato starts. Here where we live in Oregon, we start the seeds 6 to 12 weeks in advance inside. I think this year we did 12 weeks, and that was a little too long. And I follow other people and they say, you know, don't do it any more than 6 weeks. It just kind of depends on your area and when you can plant. Check out my growing zone video for more information about that sort of thing. The other thing to understand is when you're starting seeds, tomato seeds specifically, you're going to be starting them indoors. If you start them outdoors, that means that you are past your last frost date, it's not going to be too cold, and the soil has warmed up. If you start your seeds indoors, your house is probably going to be warm enough to start those seeds. If you're doing them in like your garage, you're going to need some sort of heating element to heat the soil up to at least 65 degrees so the seed can germinate. Seeds are really smart for inanimate objects, and they will wait until they're nice and toasty warm to decide to germinate. So just keep that in mind. We start all of our seeds inside. In fact, in front of this window that you see right here, I put an entire row of shelving, and we start all of our seeds inside before eventually moving them outside to our greenhouse. If you're buying tomato plants, there are some things you're gonna want to look for. You're gonna wanna make sure that your tomato plants aren't leggy. That means they're super long, they flop around, and maybe they probably don't have a lot of branches going off, but that main thing is that stem is gonna be going like this. Now, you can save leggy tomatoes, because the cool thing about tomatoes is they're hairy. And all those hairs will become roots if they touch ground. So I had many tomato plants that fell over because I did not properly take care of them this summer. They fell over, they touched the ground, the roots sprouted, and then when I went to pick them up, I just pulled roots out of the ground. So you can get really leggy tomatoes, cut off most of the branches, and then bury all of that, and then the tomato will grow up. But at some point, the plant is going to be too big, it's going to be too late in the season, etc. You just want to kind of watch out for legginess. It's not the best. The other thing you're going to want to watch out for is that your the soil in the plant is not too dry. If the plant hasn't been getting soil or hasn't been getting water for a long time, that could lead to some serious shock when you go to plant it outside. Another thing is making sure that the plants that you're buying have been outside in the sun. You're not going to shock them by taking them from inside a store where they've never seen the light of day to outside where where they get a ton of direct sunlight. You can talk to your nursery or wherever you're buying your plants from and just make sure that they've been, it's called hardened off. There are some pretty common issues with tomato plants, and we're just going to touch a few of them here. This video is definitely a little bit longer than what I normally do, but hopefully this will be a good resource for you throughout the year. So some common issues are seedling dampening off. This is specifically from a fungus that comes in and attacks a seedling and kills it off. The seedlings either don't emerge from the soil or are super small and wilt and die, or when you transplant them, the seedlings die also. The other thing I've seen, I had a bunch of seedlings die off from dampening off this last year, and when you transplant them, everything seems fine, except for it's almost like the stem just kind of starts to shrivel up. I think part of it was dampening off, and I think the other part was they were just kind of waterlogged. Like I transplanted them from one pot into a new pot, and that new pot was too wet. So ways to avoid dampening off are use sterilized potting mix. This means not soil that you grab from outside, but actually from a store that has gone through a sterilization process so that it doesn't have bugs and fungus already growing on it. Add nitrogen fertilizer once the seedlings have taken off, and also allow the surface of the soil to dry out before watering again. The next problem that you might see on your tomatoes is blossom end rot, and I'm going to throw up a picture right here that shows blossom end rot. I did have several tomato plants that had this issue this year. Again, over 200 tomato plants. I have seen quite a bit happen in 1 year. What's going to happen is your tomatoes are going to look really healthy, and then all of a sudden one day you'll turn them over and there'll be this really gross patch on the bottom, and you'll be like, what is that? That is so gross. What is wrong with my tomatoes? Blossom end rot comes because there's not enough calcium in your soil. Now, you can have too much calcium in your soil, so please don't go out there and just start calciuming up your soil. Go get a test, see what your soil needs. You want to have a pH level of about 6.5. That's what's best for tomatoes, and that's what you're kind of looking for. So before you plant your tomatoes, make sure that the soil is what it needs to be so that you can avoid blossom end rot. You can add different amendments, and I would really recommend ordering a soil sample test of your soil, taking it, your local nursery will probably be able to do that, and then talking with the nursery about what you can do to amend your soil to make sure that your tomatoes are able to grow as well as they should be. I will say you can eat tomatoes that have blossom end rot. I probably wouldn't eat the blossom end rot part, but the rest of the tomatoes should be just fine. Another issue that you might see is your fruit cracks. The tomato actually forms these cracks and then gets this really nasty little scabby area over where the tomato is cracked. This happens because tomatoes are heat-loving plants. They actually like to be quite dry, and when it rains or when they get watered, the tomato plants absorb all that water, or the tomato fruit absorbs all that water and grows too quickly and cracks open. Then the tomato comes back through and heals the scab. You can absolutely eat this food. It's not going to hurt you. Your tomatoes will be nice and juicy. It's just not best. So to avoid that, keep your tomatoes relatively dry. You don't want them, dried up, but water them only maybe once a week, depending on your area. Harvest before you water them, and harvest again before it rains. Another issue that you might face is called sun scalding, and this is when the sun gets directly onto the fruit and creates a little patchy area that is going to be discolored from what you would imagine your tomato plant is going to look like. The biggest thing you can do to prevent, or for sun scald, is to prevent it. Make sure that your tomatoes have plenty of leaves covering over the fruit. Make sure that it can grow up some sort of trellis and just provide enough shade for that fruit. The next issue you can have with your tomato plants is called cat facing. Here's a lovely picture of that. Cat facing is not bad. It is when one blossom and another blossom and another blossom grow almost like directly on top of each other. And each of those blossoms is trying to form a fruit, and all of those fruits get pushed together because they're growing all at the same time, and it becomes one fruit. You can see a cat-faced blossom here. This is what it looks like before, and I'll throw up the after picture. This is what it looks like after. If you see this, if you see these blossoms, you can just pick them. That way the plant can go to producing better fruit that doesn't have this issue. Cat-facing fruit is totally okay to eat. You just want to cut out any spots where things might have gotten in there or it's not fully ripened. Another issue you might see in your garden is leaf roll. This is when it gets too hot or too wet, or really anything happens and the tomato plant doesn't like it. It's not really something that you can do anything about. It's also not something you should worry about unless you can fix one of those problems. If you're overwatering, water less. If you're underwatering, water more. But it's not something that's going to really affect your tomatoes. The next issue that you might run into is early blight. This is something that I did see a bit of in my garden, specifically from some tomato plants that were given to me. This is when you start to see brown spots on your leaves. This will also probably happen towards the end of your growing season, although by then it's just called blight, not early blight. The leaves will turn yellow with brown spots on them, and eventually the plant will have few, if any, leaves. This is caused by another fungus that attacks the plant. If you do have blight problems, try not to plant tomatoes there again the next year, just to stop the fungus from continuing to grow. Crop rotation is a great way to make sure that you don't continue to have that, and just buying really healthy plants. The last issue that we're going to talk about today is called powdery mildew. This is not something that I experienced in my garden at all this year. I thought it was something that I was experiencing on my on my squash plants, but it turned out that was just how those particular squash leaves looked. Powdery mildew looks like someone brushed your leaves with white powder, but just like this. That's powdery mildew, and what you do about it is prevent it. So again, there's some sprays that you can use to just keep the powdery mildew off. That's something that you're going to want to talk to a local gardener about though, and see if this is even a problem that you need to be worried about. Growing requirements for tomatoes. You need heat and you need trellising. And you probably, you don't even really need the trellising, it's just helpful. So heat, tomatoes love heat. They are not cold hardy. They're not frost hardy, I should say. It can get cold, but it cannot frost around tomatoes. Tomatoes will not grow if it's too cold. Also, tomatoes won't set new blossoms if it's too hot. So keep that in mind also. You'll need to, I recommend trellising. We have cattle panels in our garden, and this was great to grow the tomatoes up. I did not use them to their full advantage this year, this last year, but this next year I am looking forward to making sure that the tomatoes are trellised and everything is just perfect. I have this dream in my head of what my garden is going to look like next year, and we'll see if it does. Finally, I am going to leave you with some tomato recommendations. These are some of our tomatoes that we really enjoyed. I talked about the black cherry tomato, so good. My friend Kathleen, who was in a video earlier this year, that's one of her favorite tomatoes. The blush tomato, that's a salad-sized tomato, so yummy. Those are two must-haves in my garden. The other tomato that I really enjoyed this year was the mushroom basket. It's beautiful, as you can see here, and it just tasted so good. And so those are kind of my three varieties that I loved. I'm going to be doing a whole here's what I'm growing in my garden this year video. So if you want to see what other tomatoes I'm growing, check out that video. If it's up, I'll link it here. If it's not yet, you'll just have to wait like the rest of us because I haven't made it yet. So here we are. I think that wraps up what I have to talk to you about. Check out the description for any further information. I'll have all sorts of links in there, resources, everything will be in the description for this video. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. If you don't want to subscribe yet, leave me a comment telling me what kind of information you're looking for that would encourage you to subscribe. I really appreciate it. If you have any knowledge, please drop it in the comment section below. I would love to expand the knowledge that is around this video. It doesn't just have to be me. I'm trying to build a community here, so please engage down there in the comments. I'll be in the comments too. And until next time, let me know what you found in your garden. That was a long video.